Christians in all ages have confessed the doctrine of divine perfection. But what does it mean to say that God is perfect? In much of contemporary theology, perfection is treated in axiological terms, as if to say simply that God is the greatest or most valuable being that we can conceive of. Here, perfection functions as a superlative title or value judgment, but what actually makes God perfect is often left unexplained. The classical tradition, however, understood perfection in a radically different and deeper sense, not as a label that we bestow on God, but as an ontological principle grounded in the very structure of reality. When we call God perfect, we're not merely assigning to him the highest value. We're not merely expressing his greatness, but we're saying something deeply metaphysical about the nature of God as ultimate reality. To understand the traditional meaning of divine perfection, we must first get clear on what the word means when used of beings in the world of which we are familiar and to which our intellects are properly proportioned. The idea of perfection, as applied to creatures, has traditionally been understood as an excellence of being, or as a completion of being. A thing is excellent or complete to the extent that it fully exemplifies its proper mode of being. Said differently, a thing is perfect in the sense that it completely achieves its own proper essence or nature and end or purpose. Such a thing is said to be an excellent specimen or excellent instance of its kind. And this notion of perfection is evident when we speak of things made or artifacts. We call things made perfect when they fully realize the form and purpose for which they have been made. So, for example, we say that a knife is perfect when it has the proper shape and sharpness for cutting. We say that a guitar is perfect when it has the proper form and parts for creating sound. We say that a novel is perfect when it has the proper balance of characters, plot, dialogue, writing style, and so on. This meaning of perfection as excellence and completion of being is also properly applied to natural substances as well. So, for example, a perfect human is one that fully develops into an adult and that completely realizes all the characteristics that a human being ought to have. A perfect oak tree is one that grows from an acorn into a tree and fully realizes all the characteristics that an oak tree ought to have, and so on. Perfection as excellence or completion in being is grounded in the same fundamental metaphysical principles that we introduced in the prior episodes on divine aseity and simplicity, namely act and potency. Something is perfect to the extent that it has fully actualized all the potentiality proper to its nature or essence. Contrawise, something will be imperfect to the extent that it has failed to actualize all the potentiality proper to its nature or essence. Each thing is perfect according as it is in act, and imperfect according as it is in potency, and lacking act. So upon analysis, perfection just is actuality of being, while imperfection just is privation of being. A thing is perfect in direct proportion to its state of actuality. And again, as we saw in the prior two episodes, at the deepest core of actuality is existence, since for something to be actual in any way, it must exist. All actuality presupposes existence, which is why existence is the act of all acts. Perfection, then, is ultimately grounded in existence, since perfection flows from actuality and actuality from existence. The more a being participates in existence, the more actuality it has, and so the more perfect it is. Existence, therefore, is not just the act of all acts. It is the perfection of all perfections. Now, it's important that we distinguish two possible modes of perfection: relative perfection and absolute perfection. A relatively perfect being is a being that has fully actualized all the potencies relative to its essence. Many have believed that angels, as immaterial beings, are relatively perfect in this sense, unlike physical beings, which are admixtures of form and matter. Angels are pure forms. Now, because matter is the principle of potency and form the principle of act, angels are beings entirely in act in relation to their forms. Angels thus have a kind of qualified perfection, since they have no unactualized potencies that are proper to their essences or to their modes of being. However, although an angel is a completely actual being relative to its essence, it is not purely actual. It's not a purely actual being relative to its existence. As we saw in the last episode on divine simplicity, every creature, even the highest angel, has an essence distinct from its existence. No creature exists by the necessity of its own nature. The being of every creature is participated and received. No creature's essence just is to be. Creatures have only a finite share of being. The act of existence relative to any creature is bounded and limited by the essence of that creature, or by the creature's specific mode of being, in distinction from a relatively perfect being, which has completely actualized its potency. An absolutely perfect being is a being utterly devoid of potency or privation of any kind. We're now in a position to understand what we mean when we say that God is perfect. Divine perfection is the doctrine that God is absolutely perfect. That is, God is fully actual and without lack in being. To say that God is perfect is to say that God is the fullness of being itself, a being of pure existence, a being whose essence just is to be. The being of God is wholly without non-being, potency, or privation. God's perfection thus transcends creaturely perfection. God is perfect not because he's an excellent specimen or complete realization of some kind or other. God's perfection is not relative to a restricted mode of being. God is the unbounded, unconstrained, and unrestricted act of being. So to say that God is perfect is to say that he is absolutely perfect, metaphysically speaking, and not just relatively perfect. God can also be said to be universally perfect, in the sense that he contains all creaturely perfections in an eminent way. That God must contain all creaturely perfections follows from the principle that whatever perfection exists in an effect must be found in the cause. Since God is the source and cause of all being, he cannot lack any excellence that belongs to any created thing. Of course, creaturely perfections do not exist in God as they exist in finite creatures, but rather they exist in God in a more eminent way. Ultimately, then, God's absolute and universal perfection is grounded in the fact that God is unrestricted being itself. And what is true for divine perfection is also true for divine infinity. The word infinite is a negative term that literally means not finite. When applied to God, the word infinite signifies the fact that God is without limit or terminus in his being. God's being is not bounded or restricted in any way. Unlike the being of creatures, the being of God is not received and contracted to a determinate finite nature. And as we saw when we looked at God's aseity and simplicity, there is nothing external nor internal to God that can limit him in any way. God's being is uncaused, independent, and underived. It's important to be clear on the kind of infinity involved here to avoid confusion. God is not quantitatively infinite. Quantitative infinity refers to endless measurable extension. This is a kind of infinity we usually think of in mathematics and involves the notions of extension, number, or magnitude. God is not infinite in the sense in which a line, number series, or body is said to be infinite. Since God is not a body, he has no measurable size or extension. So when we say that God is infinite, we are not saying that God is infinitely big. The kind of infinity proper to God is not quantitative, but qualitative. God is qualitatively infinite in the sense that he is the fullness of actuality and being. God, as we have seen, is pure act or pure existence. As such, God's being is not restricted by potency, composition, or non-being of any kind. Since his being is neither internally nor externally terminated or limited, it cannot be measured. It cannot be circumscribed. It cannot be contained. God is infinite in his actuality. God is the unbounded act of existence. Divine perfection and infinity further accentuate the radical transcendence of God. God is beyond lack. God's perfection means that he is without privation or need. God is the fullness of being itself and does not receive being from another. God is beyond limitation. God's infinity means that his being is not confined to any category, genus, or boundary. He exceeds every horizon of creaturely being. The infinitely perfect God cannot be assimilated to any creaturely mode. God is wholly other, not as one item among others, but as the ground of all being itself. God transcends the whole created order, not by being at the top of a scale of beings, but by being the limitless, perfect act of existence itself, on which all finite beings depend. And hopefully you can see that there is a manifest logic to the divine attributes. Divine perfection and divine infinity entail each other, and both are entailed by divine aseity and divine simplicity. All of God's attributes that we have so far examined flow inescapably and necessarily from God as the ultimate reality, from God as being itself, from God as the great I Am.